This is a CBC podcast.
When you think about iconic Canadian blankets, what comes to mind? Are you thinking of a cream-colored blanket, perhaps, with green, yellow, red, and blue stripes? The Hudson Bay Company has been making its famous wool point blankets since the 1700s. Besides bedding, they were also a form of currency and worn as robes. They also became a valued item among Indigenous people in Canada. But over time, these iconic blankets took on a darker history. Paul Hackett is an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan's Department of Geography and Planning, where his research focuses on medical geography, Aboriginal health, and historical epidemiology. Welcome, Paul.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Rosanna.
So at one time, the Hudson's Bay blanket was used as a kind of currency and even as a status symbol. Can you tell me about that?
Well, it certainly was an important trade good in the fur trade. And as you say, it's iconic across Canada and was well valued by the Indigenous people in the country. It's probably beyond the utilitarian aspect of it. There's also a bit of a political meaning to it in terms of cementing friendships and relationships there as well. But certainly was indicative of that relationship in the fur trade between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. And when you say that it was used as a trade item, what kinds of things was it used to trade for?
Predominantly furs, but one could also trade for food, and the fur traders themselves were dependent on, in many contexts, Indigenous people for their food, for transport, for all manner of services and goods. But predominantly, I think the key thing was to obtain furs to sell back in Europe.
Mm. And when did that change?
Well, we start to see, I think, later in the 19th century, we start to see differences in the trade. But as there's more competition, perhaps the Hudson's Bay Company's blanket loses a bit of its luster. And as time progresses, maybe it isn't as seen as the key trade good in the fur trade. And
then eventually, it seems that it has fell into some sort of disrepute, as it were. Many people have, heard the rumors that these blankets were infected with smallpox and then given to First Nation communities. Did you find any evidence that the Hudson's Bay Company was involved in that?
I've found absolutely no evidence that the Hudson's Bay Company ever purposely infected anybody with blankets and smallpox. And I sort of recognize the sort of power of those stories and the power of that history. And I don't want to sort of say that it never happened. But I think I would argue that that there's no evidence for it. That doesn't mean that that didn't occur, but there's no evidence of it as far as I've been able to find, other than oral histories, I guess, stories. And two, that it would have been very much against the interests of the Hudson's Bay Company to release a lethal disease among the people who are supplying their furs and buying their goods, and potentially expose themselves to the risk of retaliation if indeed that was found out.
Now, you said there was no evidence that you could find that this happened, but that you're talking about written evidence. You also mentioned that there's oral history around this. What kinds of oral history have you found?
Nothing other than more recent things. And I'm thinking that there may be some conflation of the Hudson's Bay Company as representing all sort of European interests in Western North America, perhaps, and other potential businesses and entities who may have engaged in this behavior. And we know, for instance, in the 1700s that the British certainly did purposely transmit smallpox during the 7 Years' War at Fort Pitt, which is now Pittsburgh, during the siege there. So we know that it did happen, and I'm wondering if there isn't some conflation of these things. But most of what I've heard is not in older oral histories, but in more recent things. And again, that's not me saying it hasn't happened or that it isn't valid. It's me sort of wanting to question more about what the context is of these stories.
Right. So it did happen, as you said, at Fort Pitt during the 7 Years' War in the United States. But when or how, I guess, did this rumor come across the border?
That's a great question. And it's people who have a greater ability in sort of interpreting Indigenous stories or maybe conducting that kind of research might find that out. I know, again, going back to the evidence, that there was a case on the upper Missouri River where an American fur trader certainly claimed that he was going down to St. Louis to pick up some smallpox to eliminate some of the local people. That was his claim, and I never was able to sort of verify that he ever pulled it off. But the idea was out there, certainly. So I think for the Hudson's Bay Company, their position in the fur trade west and northwest was very precarious, such that had they been accused, the consequences would, particularly through most of the fur trade period, they required the local people to feed them, to help them, to transport their goods, to do almost everything for them. There were small numbers of people who were essentially reliant on local people for their well-being and their health and their trade. It just made no sense for them.
I also understand that the Hudson's Bay was also involved in public health in some way. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, they played a major role in providing what we'd call public health services to First Nations and other Indigenous people in Canada for much of the fur trade era. Oftentimes it might be provision of food when necessity reared its head, or in the case of smallpox, it might be early on trying to prevent the spread of smallpox, say at York Factory in northern Manitoba, through a quarantine program, and then later on through mass vaccination programs across Canada in the 1830s. They were, I guess, the de facto public health agency in much of Western Canada up until Confederation. It seems atypical for a fur trading company to be involved in provisioning goods, looking after the elderly when necessary, or in this case, distributing vaccine across much of Western Canada. It just seems out of role for them, but in fact, it makes a lot of sense because if we look at the impact, we have a joint stock company that is basically motivated by profits, that if they want to maintain those profits, you have to make sure that there are stable conditions, that people are healthy, that they are able to trap, to hunt as well, to provide food. So the Hudson Bay Company had a very vested interest in making sure that things ran as proper as well as they should commonly.
And so if we don't know when this rumor came across, why do you think that it still persists to this day?
I think there's a certain amount of discontent, and people still feel a bit of animosity towards the northern stores and northern operators who charge outrageous prices for food or who don't provide good service. Or I know that people can remember back to a time when the Hudson's Bay Company was not looking after the best interest of Indigenous people in Canada. Certainly they made a lot of money off of the transfer of the Rupert's land eventually to Canada. And so I think there is a certain amount of animosity towards the company, and some of it is rightfully felt.
Paul, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Rosanna.
That was Paul Hackett, Assistant Professor of Medical Geography at the University of Saskatchewan. We're going into the Winnipeg Art Gallery vault. This is exactly how I thought an art museum would look like. All the treasures. I'm with Jamie Isaac, curator of Indigenous and Contemporary Art at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. She's about to show me a piece by artist Rosalie Favell and talk about why the Hudson's Bay blanket keeps popping up in the work of Indigenous artists. And this is it? This is brilliant. Oh my gosh, you have to tell me what's going on here.
Sure, it's Rosalie Favell's I Woke to Find My Spirit Had Returned. This work Rosalie did in 1999 out of her series Plains Warrior Artist, and it's print on paper. It has Rosalie posed as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Instead of Virgin Mary looking over her bed, she has Xena the warrior princess. And it shows her awakening beneath a Hudson Bay blanket. On looking is the cast of The Wizard of Oz. And instead of the uncle, it is Luriel looking through the window. And I think your reaction upon seeing it coming in today was pretty amazing. You laughed really hard. And
I was a knee slapper. I slapped the knee. I was like, that's amazing.
I think you were doubling over. It's a really beautiful work, and within its how she uses satire to think through our Canadian history.
The HBC blanket is quite iconic, and it tends to show up in a lot of Indigenous artwork. Why do you think that so many artists are weaving this into their work?
Well, the blanket means so much to different people in Canada, and I think it's emblematic of the trade histories here. It's also emblematic of the smallpox endemic that happened in the early 1800s, late 1700s, and the idea that smallpox was actually spread through biological warfare in the trading of the HBC blankets.
Would it surprise you to learn that earlier we had spoken to a historian who studied particularly the HPC blanket, and he found actually no evidence that, written evidence, let's be clear about that, that the HPC blanket was used in spreading smallpox to First Nations. That would have been counterproductive, he argues. That wouldn't have made any sense. Perhaps that happened in the States, but not on Canada's side. So does that surprise you to know that that's not actually something that's documented?
I think that our history has been censored in different ways and continues to be, and public documents continue to be censored. The research that I've looked through was late 1700s, and there were letters apparently that were found, and it was with the Commander-in-Chief of British Forces in North America, Geoffrey Amherst, in 1763, that encouraged the use of blankets infected with smallpox as a means of biological warfare. And there are few and upcoming art historians that are finding this out and openly talking about the smallpox endemic that happened and the usage of the blankets to spread European disease through trade. And so others are also saying that the blanket was not necessarily intentional. It wasn't an intentional policy to spread biological warfare, but nonetheless the blankets were coming from European ships here to North America to then trade with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So the question on whether it was intentional or not is questionable and really interesting to unpack in our history.
You might say it's a little piece of history we've yet to uncover.
A blanketed history.
You're good. So when people see work that reimagines this iconic blanket in a way that they maybe hadn't considered before, how do they often react?
I think, just through my own experience of working with the blanket, with Leah Decter's work, Official Denial, it was really interesting because some people actually got really upset when we were using the blanket as a document or archive to talk about historical and contemporary ongoing injustices of colonialism in Canada. Indigenous artists, contemporary artists, are using the blanket as a cultural material that is political and that is cultural and historical to bring that material into contemporary narratives around our histories. It's another form of trade by trading this information that we know and that people have researched, and to bring that into a larger Canadian dialogue. I think to kind of dismantle what we know about our histories in order for us to more understand one another is a really interesting way of using the blanket in art.
Thank you, Jamie. I always feel much smarter after I speak with you.
Oh, you too.
Jamie Isaac is curator of Indigenous and Contemporary Art at the Winnipeg Art Gallery.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.